is Office Hours at Duke University. Today's conversation is with Professor James Hamilton. He'll be talking about new models for the news media. Everyone watching is invited to join the conversation. To ask Professor Hamilton a question, send an email to live@duke.edu, tweet it with the tag Duke Live, or post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office and Professor Hamilton. We're here at your online office hours. So let's hit a few highlights about you. You are an advocate of funding watchdog journalism by nonprofit or low-profit means. You are the author of All the News That's Fit to Sell. And here at Duke, you are the director of the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy. You're also the Charles S. Sydnor Professor of Public Policy with additional appointments in political science and economics. So if we're going to talk about the news business, we can start with the news of the day. Our regional paper here, the Raleigh News and Observer. When you look at the front page of the N&O, what does it make you think about the state of the news business?
The N&O is, like many large metro dailies, really getting thinner. That's the first thing that will strike you. Mm-hmm. About 5 years ago, the N&O had 260 people in their newsroom. With the latest round of layoffs, that could be down close to 100. And what I've written about and what I'm concerned about is the stories that aren't told in our area because of the decline of papers like the N&O. I should mention right up front that John Drescher has a MPP degree from Duke.
And the editor of the News and Observer?
That's right, the editor of the News and Observer, and is very interested in public affairs coverage and has actually increased resources for investigative reporting. They've carved that out as one of the things that they want to preserve, and I think that with the stories that they've done on former Governor Easley and the stories that they've done on the reform of the parole system, that's the type of coverage that they're trying to still provide even in a world where the paper's getting thinner.
And a story just today on state Medicaid overspending, state to public affairs journalism.
That's right. If you think about the information people demand in their lives, Anthony Downs said that we demand 4 types of information. One is consumer, so what time is the Duke game going to be on? Producer, those are things that I need to know to do my job. Entertainment, that's just something that's fun to know. And then voter or civics information. And the first 3 markets, consumer, producer, and entertainment, work pretty well because if you don't get the information, if you don't search it out, you don't get the benefit. So last fall I was living up to a stereotype. I was a professor in search of a Prius, and I went on to Edmunds.com and I spent 2 days, and I think I got a better deal because I had invested time in researching. If I'd spent 2 days researching global warming, climate change, the Obama healthcare plan, none of those policy issues would have changed because in a statistical sense, my vote doesn't matter. I'm not the marginal voter or marginal decision maker. And so what that means, if you're a newspaper editor, you recognize that there are stories that are very important to the community that people remain rationally ignorant about. And by that I mean, as a community, we'd be better off if we were able to read stories about what's going on in the Durham Herald. And if the Durham Herald could tell the story of public school budget cuts. But most of us free ride and say, I'll let somebody else pay attention, I'll let somebody else read. And that means that there's not great demand expressed for public affairs coverage at state or local level.
So in your book, All the News That's Fit to Sell, instead of talking about the 5 W's of journalism, who, what, when, why, and where, you talk about the 5 W's of the journalism business. Mm-hmm. So what are they? How, when you're analyzing the newspaper, the economics of it, what are those W's you're looking at?
So if we had a journalism school, we don't. We have a journalism policy certificate program at Duke in the Sanford School, where we do have some skills classes where you are taught the 5 W's of a story: who, what, where, when, and why. But if you think about the economics of media content in general, it's determined by a set of things I call the 5 economic W's. Who cares about a particular piece of information? What are they willing to pay for it? Or what are others willing to pay for their attention? Where else can you reach these readers or viewers? When is this profitable? That brings in the cost structure of stories. And why is this profitable? That brings in the definition of property rights to information. And except for the editor of the Wall Street Journal, I have seen him talk, and I do believe that he does roll out of bed every morning and say it's a great day to maximize profits. But he's an outlier. Most journalists don't do that. But the set of stories that survive and the set of organizations that are going to survive are really determined by those 5 economic W questions.
So when we talk about the news business, I think we have to talk about the New York Times. Mm-hmm. Is their economic model different than, say, a regional paper like the NNL?
Sure. The New York Times and the Metro dailies do face some similar problems where we're in the Great Recession, so advertising has gone down. The internet, particularly Craigslist. I've been on a panel with Craig. He's a wonderful guy. He's actually given money to Berkeley Journalism School. But Craigslist has really sapped the market for classified advertising, which at one point might have accounted for 35% of newspaper revenues. So the New York Times, drop in advertising, drop in classified. On the internet, if there's so many different ways that you could get information, it's almost like a perfectly competitive market. And in a perfectly competitive market, price gets competed down to marginal cost, and the marginal cost of one more page view is 0. So it's very hard to charge for news on the internet if you don't have a unique or distinctive product. So what's different, though, about the Times is that the Times is able to aggregate up the attention of college-educated people all across the United States. And so they can have that niche market. So number one, they can aggregate up the attention of people who are truly interested in public affairs. It may not be a high percentage, but if the U.S. is your market, that's a large absolute number, and that you can sell them to advertisers. Number two, the Times, like the Post, has a dual stock structure so that the founding families actually have some leeway and more say about how the property is run. And what that means is that they may be able to trade off some profits for the idea that they are doing the right thing. Ironically, as the New York Times has spread across the United States, there's at least some evidence. A paper by Joel Waldfogel and Lisa George, who are 2 economists, had a great title. It said, "Does the New York Times spread ignorance and apathy?" Because the idea was they looked at different cities which got home delivery of the New York Times at different times. And what they found is that as people started to subscribe to the New York Times in a city, as the college-educated population began to read the Times in hard copy, they would drop their local paper. And as they dropped their local paper, they were less likely to participate in midterm or local elections. So it's ironic that the existence of the Times and the wide distribution allows you to focus on it, but it actually can undercut the market for your local daily.
Professor Hamilton, we've got a question that's come in by email here, and everyone watching can ask a question of Professor Hamilton. To do that, send an email to live@duke.edu. Tweet your question with the tag Duke Live or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. We're talking about the New York Times and charging for content. They've announced last month that next year, for some frequent users, they plan to charge for online viewing of their stories. Curtis asks, willingness to pay for content seems to be divided, at least in part, along generational lines. Mm-hmm. Can cash for content newspaper models hope to survive without convincing today's under 30s that news is worth paying for?
So that's a great question. At newspaper marketing meetings, they joke that they own the market of people over 80. So older folks are still reading hard copy newspapers. The Times experiment is interesting because the idea is that if other people will show you the information for free, you can't charge for it. So the question is what you have unique? And the Times, because it's aggregating the attention of college-educated people around the country, they may be able to invest more in stories so that their stories are distinctive and that people might be willing to pay for that. And in part, that does break down along generational lines. If you look at young people, many of them are grazers. So they'll look at Yahoo News, or there was a recent study about Google News that showed about 45% of the folks who went on Google News didn't actually click through on the stories. All they wanted was a headline and a summary. So if you're a light reader, if you're a grazer, then you may not want to pay for what's behind the paywall. What I'm most concerned, though, is that the stories do get created and told. So if the New York Times is able to experiment and sustain itself to tell stories of national and international politics, we'll all benefit from that. That'll be what economists call positive spillovers or positive externalities. The real question is who's going to be the New York Times of state politics or local politics?
And in talking about that question, you wrote a paper on a possible hybrid for-profit, nonprofit funding model of our regional paper here, the News and Observer. So what would that look like of some private donors, some foundations contributing to that civic affairs reporting?
Sure. So some of our viewers may remember the murder of Eve Carson, the UNC student. And that prompted the News and Observer to do a very in-depth look at the parole system in North Carolina. And what they found was that between 2000 and 2008, 580 people on parole in North Carolina murdered people. And there were a lot of problems with the parole system that series exposed. That series cost $200,000 to produce. And what the News and Observer is not able to do is monetize the many different benefits to society that story created. So that story created increased legislative activity on the parole system. They are now reforming the parole technology and databases, and Wake County is an experiment where that is happening. So the News and Observer spends a long time, 6 months, invests $200,000, runs a 3-part series, has a big impact on society. But the problem is the people who will not be murdered because the parole system was changed, they don't roll out of bed and say, thank you, News and Observer. So the News and Observer has been providing what is essentially a public good or a public benefit. And in the old days for newspapers, you could do well and do good at the same time. If your profit rate, which it was for some metro dailies, was 35%, if you said, I'm going to invest in some investigative or accountability coverage, I'll take 33%, they were able to do that. Now, they're not. And that's what I'm concerned about. So how do nonprofits come in? If you look at some areas of the country, MinnPost, the Voice of San Diego, these are local nonprofit websites with about 10 to 12 reporters. All they focus on is public affairs, and they take tax-deductible donations, and they are run with relatively low salaries. And when you make your contribution, you know what you're doing is supporting the type of watchdog coverage that holds public officials accountable. So that's one model, a standalone nonprofit on the web.
So when we're talking about nonprofit versus for-profit journalism, we have a question here that's come in from Carlos by email. Everyone watching can ask a question. To do that, send it by email to live@duke.edu, tweet it with the tag Duke Live, or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. And Carlos, his question is, my two main news sources are NPR and the New York Times, one profit and one not-for-profit. My question is, can an entity like the New York Times actually turn into a nonprofit?
We did a conference last May where we had Penny Abernathy, who was a former executive at the New York Times and is now the Knight Journalism Chair at UNC. She actually wrote a paper on what it might take to make the New York Times a nonprofit. Again, the Times is unique in that it's really trying to give you international and national coverage, aggregate up that attention of college-educated people around the country. They considered a nonprofit option. They rejected it because I think they believed that the combination of advertising, which will come back after the recession, and their experiment with the paywall may help them survive. You do see, however, in other types of public affairs coverage, like the Huffington Post and the San Diego newspaper, both of them have established separate nonprofit entities which fund investigative stories. So you still have the for-profit newspaper, but it has an associated nonprofit side which is generating stories. So that's sort of a hybrid. And you could also potentially have something called a L3C, low profit limited liability company, which has different types of investors. Some of them will come in and say, we're a foundation and we're going to give you an investment and we want a very low rate of return. You might have good corporate citizens, individuals, wealthy billionaires. There's still some on the West Coast. And they would say, we'll invest, but we expect a low rate of return. And if 2/3 of the folks are expecting a low rate, if the foundation makes what's called a program-related investment, and the ideological owners say, we'll take a low rate, that might leave a market rate for some of the other investors. So that's the idea that newspapers have always had a commercial side, sports, bridge, entertainment, movies, and a side that deals with public affairs that hasn't been fully supported by the market. City council coverage, education coverage, things like that. What the L3C would do is say, we are going to make a low profit, and as a foundation, you can invest in us, and but we believe what we're going to do up front has benefits to the community, so don't expect us to earn a market rate of return.
Good. We've got another question that's come in from Grant himself, a new media journalist, and he asks, my question for you in talking about these nonprofit or hybrid models is, how can your proposed business model for newspapers compete with the for-profit-minded media institutions for readership eyeballs, with the corporations that pump large amounts into advertising and promotions, while the nonprofits likely have to scale down their operations? A kind of a David and Goliath nonprofit for-profit.
Sure. I think that there will be niches. So if you look at national news on cable, you basically see product differentiation. Fox, if you want your conservative worldview reflected back to you, Fox News will do that. If you want your liberal worldview reflected back to you, Rachel Maddow will do that on MSNBC. If you are sort of somewhere in the middle, CNN will do that. So I view the media not as monolithic, but as divided up, offering different viewpoints and to different demographics. And if you look at metro newspapers, they might essentially evolve into one model could be elite magazines. So they still publish, they're still hard copy, they're focused on public affairs, but they're doing less than what they used to. In the old days, they would try to tell you all the stories, but now they're having to pick and choose what stories to tell you.
Okay, we've talked about for-profit and nonprofit, private charitable, but we have an email question here that comes in from Victor. It gets into public funding, and he says, some have suggested a new AmeriCorps program that would support young journalists in starting community news websites and low-power radio stations. There's also been the suggestion that we do a better job of funding public TV. What do you think of these proposals for boosting journalism?
It's interesting. I think that it's clear that the government has a large impact on media markets today. What I'm most concerned about is that investigative or accountability coverage. And to my mind, the things that the government could do to support that would include the IRS making clear that newspapers could be run as nonprofits. Right now, there's a set of decisions that suggest that there's uncertainty about that. So if the IRS removed that uncertainty, that would allow more nonprofit newspapers to potentially flourish or get started.
So you actually wrote a letter to the IRS about this. I mean,
I did.
What are you advocating? What's your direction to them?
Well, what I'd like them to think about is public education is funded because it has positive spillovers on society. If your child gets educated, he or she is a better voter, and that benefits all of us. You can make the same argument, and in fact, statistics back this up, that the people who are engaged in reading newspapers do have a positive spillover on the rest of us. And so I think that these spillovers, which are hard for the newspaper to get credit for, again, go back to that Eve Carson story. It's hard for the News and Observer to get credit in the marketplace for that. But we all benefit when those stories are told.
Now, there is a model that's been out there for decades, a public radio model that is part government funded, part foundation funded, and part individual donor funded. And if you drove in and listened to our affiliate WNC, they're doing their fundraiser right now. Could that model just be taken and brought over to the newspaper?
It's interesting. I support WUNC. I donated my car to WUNC in November. I think right now in some cities you are seeing these standalone nonprofit websites that are public affairs focused are partnering with the local radio stations. Traditionally, the local public radio stations have not been hotbeds of investigative or accountability coverage, though. So I think it would really require a change in their branding, in part because accountability or watchdog sometimes means that you're saying that public officials are corrupt or not doing a good job. And that's sometimes been hard for local public radio stations to do. But that could change.
Good, Professor Hamilton. We've got another question that's come in by email, and everybody watching can send in a question. To do that, email it to live@duke.edu, tweet it with the tag Duke Live, or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. And this question gets us into the whole area of new media, and it comes from David. He asks, what will be the impact on the news media of the Apple's iPad and similar devices?
I think that's going to be an empirical question. So I don't think you can use theory to answer that. I think it'll be fun to see whether the whole idea of the internet and reducing the ability of people to charge subscriptions on the internet is that you have so many different avenues on the internet to get your news that it's difficult for you to charge for commodity information. However, if the iPad allows you to create an experience which is unique, say if you go onto YouTube right now, there's a video which Phil Bennett, the Patterson chair at Duke, sent me. There's a video of the Sports Illustrated on a tablet. That is unique content, and so you might be able to charge for that.
Okay, that gets to another question here that's come in by email from Grant. He's a new media journalist, and he said, since I specialize in online video, what type of online video news do you see such nonprofit LLC newspaper models putting out that will set themselves apart from their corporate-heavy, profit-minded competitors? How could they stand to appear more prominent in the search engines such as Google, where being found and visible via keyword searches is arguably a very important first step to getting viewer engagement?
Yeah, that's a great question. Google knows that it has a hard time right now surfacing and giving people credit for unique stories. There's often more credit for having the updated story. And so, for instance, when Phil Bennett was doing the story on the Walter Reed scandal at the Washington Post.
Phil Bennett, former managing editor of the Washington Post, now on faculty here.
That's right. And so when they did, when he was doing that story, the Washington Post invested a lot of time. Dana Priest, who came to Duke recently to give a lecture about investigative journalism, she invested a lot of time going into Walter Reed, talking about the difficult health care that our veterans were receiving. But once that story burst, then if you look at Google News, what you then see is people saying the Washington Post have reported, or even not crediting the Post. So the Post drops down in terms of the Google News ranking as more people just parrot or repeat what was said. So I agree with Grant that it is, right now, Google doesn't give you much credit for being original in the search engine. One other thing he talked about video. I think that there's a real role for the government to help develop algorithms and software to lower the cost of reporters to discovering stories, including using video. So for instance, right now, if I had a stack of 100 documents on this desk, if those documents dealt with the war on terror, the government has already funded wonderful software to pull out the relationships between organizations and names. It's called Jigsaw, and it was funded at Georgia Tech. And if you had a collection of videos on YouTube and wanted to do text mining, where you take the audio and visual and create a transcript and mine it. Again, if it's about defense, DARPA and Homeland Security has funded Carnegie Mellon to analyze YouTube videos in 3 languages, Arabic, Chinese, and English. So the idea is that the government recognizes that they need to fund software to help in the war on terror. I believe that what the government should also do is fund the development of open source tools that would allow journalists and citizens to hold government accountable. And that would allow you, for instance, if you think about the state of Wisconsin, there are over 1,000 people who file financial disclosure forms, state legislators, but they're often handwritten and they're not online. And so you have the appearance of transparency without real transparency. Same thing, state of Wisconsin, committee hearings are videotaped, but nobody's going to sit through 10 hours. So what you need there is a transcript that you can mine to find the conflict, to find the story.
So is someone weighing into this, a young journalist? We've got a question about that comes here from Sarah, and she says, what advice do you have for a young journalist at Duke or any other university? Can they still aspire to write just for a printed publication, or has it become essential for them to also develop multimedia skills?
It's interesting. For the first time, I've actually had students, undergrads at Duke, who have an interest in journalism, who hide it from their parents because nobody wants to go home and say, I really appreciate my Duke education and I'm going to a declining industry, which I think is sad, because I believe what you should do is follow your passion, pick the path that most interests you, and that's what you're going to excel in. So I think that it's all about, for young journalists, narrative, storytelling, and learning the tools that help you discover stories. Because what the real problem here is, it relates to the stories that aren't being told. There's a lot of pressure on computer-savvy journalists at newspapers. Once you learn how to program or have some skills, the idea is that you get pushed into a job to make the website prettier. But what that doesn't mean is that you don't get the ability to dig down deep to create the story.
What about your own personal passion? You got a PhD in economics from a school up north, and then, but you've since got into studying journalism from the economic perspective. So what was it in yourself that led you to that?
I started my life as an economist, as a microeconomist, looking at pollution, and in particular how information revelation changes the behavior of polluters. The EPA has a program called the Toxics Release Inventory, where polluters have to tell you what comes out of their smokestack every year. And one day I read that there was a debate in government about creating a list of people who advertise on violent television programming. And it really struck me was that that potentially was looking at TV violence as a pollution problem. And that maybe I could take the toolkit of an environmental economist and write about a media market. So I actually ended up writing a book called Channeling Violence, the Economic Market for Violent Television Programming, that looked at the negative spillovers that the media can have. And then I ended up, economics is a dismal science, but not everything has to be dismal. So my next book was All the News That's Fit to Sell, where I look at the positive spillovers that the media have when they cover public affairs. But I got into studying the media because I was interested in what economists called externalities, things that aren't fully captured in the marketplace. And I was interested in information provision.
Good. We're getting a lot of interest about this economics and new models of news media. We've got a question here that's come in from Clay by email, and everyone watching can also ask a question to Professor Hamilton. To do that, tweet your question with the tag Duke Live, email it to live@duke.edu, or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. This question from Clay says he's a documentary producer. Local TV news operations encourage viewers to go to their websites, but as they do so, they lose more viewers of their traditional news broadcast. The ad revenue from websites, however, is not making up for the lost ad revenue from the broadcast, putting in financial strain on stations. Some have had to cut news staffs as a result. Assuming revenue will continue to be advertising based, what's the best new business model going to be for local TV stations?
That is tough, because what you see across media is a dispersion of eyeballs. So all those gadgets that people have allow you to consume content on many different platforms. Even teenagers now, when they watch TV, they're very likely to be on their laptop too. So the division of attention means that the old days where especially TV stations had a great benefit, the licenses were restricted, there were only 3 or 4 players in a market, and you were able to charge very high advertising rates. Those days are gone because there's so many different ways to get somebody's attention now. So in a way, local TV news is facing the same problem as metropolitan dailies. Given that there's so many different ways for advertisers to reach people, what can you do? 2 things are, number one, you can seek nonprofit funding for the stories that you tell. And there are entities out there that are issue specific, that want to generate stories, say, on global warming or the environment. And those, they sometimes will fund work by TV stations and sometimes by standalone internet outlets and sometimes by newspapers. The second thing, right now the Federal Trade Commission is of 2 minds about the online advertising market. There's one part of the Federal Trade Commission which says we really want to help people thrive on the internet, and we want to do everything we can to make sure that you can charge high advertising rates if that's going to support news. However, there's something called behavioral ad targeting on the internet, where Google and Yahoo use what they know about you, combine with an outlet, and show you a targeted ad. So during that week that I was looking for a Prius on the News and Observer website, I might have been more likely to see a Prius ad. And there are a set of folks who don't like that. They feel like that's an invasion of their privacy. So one interesting public policy debate that I think is going to unfold over the next year is, will there be a way for us to have a debate about whether you're willing to trade off some of your privacy if it gets higher ad rates for the local news outlets that you're worried about? It's interesting, when I teach my media policy class to Duke undergrads, I say, would you ever trade off privacy for lower prices? And they always say no. And then I say, who has a Kroger card? And they then realize that in their daily life, they often do give companies information about themselves in order to get a better deal.
So you're talking about funding specific kinds of stories through foundations, individuals, and we've got an email question about that. It comes in from Ben, and he says, if an L3C model is used for investigatory or specialty journalism, such as science news, how can conflict of interest issues be avoided with regards to funding sources?
That's a great question. If you think about the incentives to create information, it could be, I want you to pay me. That's the subscription model. It could be, I want to sell your eyeballs to advertisers. It could be, I want your vote. That's the partisan information. It could be, I want to change what you're thinking about. That's the nonprofit model. So I think, and then there's also pure expression of, I just have some information and I want to share it with people. So I think that nonprofit funding can work if there's transparency and disclosure. Ben is right that people give this money for a reason. They want you to think about the environment rather than, say, healthcare. So that's going to be implicit in the bargain. But I think it's, economists often say, it takes a paradigm to beat a paradigm. So some people would say we need to remain pure, not accept nonprofit funding, not accept subsidized money from foundations. That may be a world where your Metro Daily keeps shrinking. And so you do see now the New York Times, the Washington Post, they're partnering with nonprofits. ProPublica is an example where the story is published in the Times or in the Post, but the funding came from a nonprofit, but it's disclosed.
And we should say, in full disclosure, we're here at a nonprofit publicizing research done here at Duke in a news style.
That's right.
And I think that brings up an interesting example of the White House. WhiteHouse.gov has been aggressive with new media. President Obama just did a YouTube interview. So questions were submitted by YouTube. He did a live webcast back. And we should say that Macon Phillips, their new media director at the White House, is a Duke grad. And but this is the government, in a sense, reporting on, framing issues that the government rules on. So what about that of a source sort of reporting on itself?
That's right. I think you will see more nonprofits providing information. Duke is one. Eric Roston works at the Nicholas Institute. He used to work at Time Magazine. He's a blogger. He posts every Thursday afternoon something called the Climate Post, which talks about political battles in Washington over global warming. So that's an example of a nonprofit, the Nicholas Institute, providing information. With the federal government, you do see a mantra of transparency. It's not clear yet whether they're living up to that. And by that I mean that it's not clear whether it's symbolic politics or whether they're serious about making the data searchable and provided in a way that you can really mine it and hold people accountable. The prospects for freedom of information are much worse at the local and state level, in part because state government, local government, they look at reporters and they say, we know that your parent company is not going to hire a lawyer anymore. And so you weren't able to go to that meeting, we closed it, sue us. And so the estimated probability of of a newspaper hiring a lawyer has gone down. And so we actually see the prospects for less disclosure at the state and local level. I should say also that also applies to nonprofits. I've talked to at least one person involved in who used to counsel nonprofit institutions, and he said, my advice was always, if you found something really bad, get it out, control the story, you tell the story first. And he said, now I wouldn't give that advice because the probability that somebody's watching you as a nonprofit has declined so much that if you find the scandal, deal with it internally, but don't air it because the reporter who would have written about it has been fired 2 years ago.
Professor Hamilton, Ben has just tweeted in as Young Landis to say thanks for answering the question. We've got about 200 people participating in the office hours right now. Everyone watching can ask a question. You can tweet it with the tag Duke Live, send it by email to live@duke.edu, or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. We've got another email question here that's come in from Stuart, and he asks, is there any role to be played by retirees, other volunteers who might help professional journalists be in more places by serving as stringers at community meetings, court trials, and other events?
I definitely think that there's a lot of what economists would call human capital out there, people who have a lot of knowledge, maybe because they were reporters or maybe because they were engineers in another life, and the newspaper calls upon them for help. The Guardian did a great crowdsourcing experiment where they knew that members of parliament's expense reports were coming out, thousands of documents, and they said, how can we mine this data? They made a game on the web, and they put it out there and people could compete to look at the expense reports, and you would basically say, I think this is harmless, or you should look into this. So I think that citizen journalists can lower the cost of traditional journalists for discovering stories. I think also we're in a period where we're free riding off the success of former Metro newspapers. So if you look at MinnPost, Voice of San Diego, some of those have people, journalists, whose skills were paid for by Metro dailies that have now obviously fired a lot of people. So what you need to worry about down the road is who's going to train the people, who's going to create the skills among younger people.
So to frame this up philosophically, you've got one school of thought that says, hey, a news item is like a toaster. There's supply and demand, and what's supplied is what's demanded. It's all market economics. And there's another school of thought that would say, the news in a community is like our city park, and you shouldn't charge for access. It should be a public good that's publicly funded. So where do you fall in that? I mean, what argument is more persuasive to you?
I think that there is something special about information markets. And you're right that this is very controversial. In the 1980s, the FCC, the chairman said the public interest is defined by the public's interest. So if information is valuable, it will be created. And he actually said TV is just a toaster with pictures, and that there's nothing special about the information markets. Even as recently as FCC Chairman Michael Powell, on his first day as the commissioner chair, he was asked about the digital divide. And he said, I think there's a Mercedes divide. I'd like to have a Mercedes, but I can't afford it. So there's a set of people who say information is just like any other market. I think that what they're missing out on is what I would call a systematic market failure of positive externalities. In English, what that means is that if I read this story about the city council, it's going to benefit other people, but I don't really get up in the morning and say, time to do my civic duty necessarily. So there are stories that will benefit society that won't get told, because we essentially say, I'll let somebody else pay attention. I'll free ride off of others. Now, in the old days, media properties were owned by people, by families, and so they were willing to trade off profits for doing the right thing. In fact, in the 1980s, if you looked in the US, there were two industries where family or individual ownership was predominant: sports franchises and media properties. And both of them gave you some sort of psychic return for having an impact on the community. Through a lot of tax law problems, a lot of individual ownership went away, and you have now media properties basically run as for-profit entities. But what that means is that they won't focus on the positive spillovers that they have on society, and public affairs coverage will be underprovided.
I think we have to tell the story of the St. Petersburg Times when you talk about family ownership and the transition into this new nonprofit model.
Sure. So the St. Petersburg Times is a for-profit newspaper owned by a nonprofit foundation. Nelson Pointer essentially gave away his newspaper, and he said, I've never met my great-grandchildren, and I might not like them. So he basically said, I'm not going to give this to my family. I'm going to create a system where the incentives will be that the newspaper can focus on creating community news, things that are important for the community, and there'll be less profit pressure. Now, the St. Petersburg Times still faces the same advertising problems that other newspapers do now. So they have the same problems, but the nonprofit status means that they don't have to make potentially as drastic as cuts as other newspapers.
So I'm talking about family ownership. I mean, if you got your lunch with Arthur Sulzberger, what would be your pitch to him, future of the New York Times?
First, I thank the Sulzberger family for donating to the Child and Family Policy Center at Duke. I know that some of the Sulzbergers are Duke alums, and they have funded a lecture series, which is a form of information provision. So I'm very thankful for that. And I guess what I would be concerned about is I'm happy that they're trying this experiment with the paywall, but I was also a little bit disappointed that they didn't try to get more funding from nonprofit sources for the particular type of accountability or watchdog coverage. So I guess I would have urged him to think about that.
I got you. You also mentioned the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, and their role in this. And we should say that Commissioner Robert McDowell was just down here this week. So, yeah, what is their role? They govern media ownership, how much media can be owned by one company within a given market. How important is that in this equation?
It's interesting. I was very thankful that Commissioner McDowell, Duke class of '85, came down and spoke to my media policy class. He spoke to a lunch with Samford MPP students. I think that the FCC today, with Chairman Julius Janikowski, has just launched an inquiry about the future of journalism. So I think potentially you're seeing a movement away from the idea that the public interest is defined by the public's interest, that there might be something wrong with media markets. But it's going to be interesting to see exactly what the FCC can do about public affairs coverage. The FCC has very blunt instruments right now to deal with news markets. There's the rule that prohibits, in most circumstances, the cross-ownership within a market of a newspaper and a TV. In my mind, most of the problems of stories not being told, it comes from the demand side, the failure, not from the supply side or ownership questions. I will say that Duke's, Sanford, media classes have had an impact on public policy. When I was writing my book on TV violence, in my media policy class, the final assignment was to go to our local Durham affiliates, look in the public inspection files, and see what our local stations were claiming were educational programming for children. When the students at Duke wrote their final papers, it turned out that one of our stations was claiming that Geraldo in Beverly Hills 90210 was educational programming for children. And they even wrote about an episode called Beach Blanket Brandon, which was about having the question of whether to have sex at the prom. And they used that as their educational programming for children. I was really shocked by that. So were my students. So I sent a suggestion to the FCC in their rulemaking process, and I said, you should require stations to list on the internet. You should have a publicly available database that lists what educational programs are being shown for children. And that idea was adopted. So it was an interesting example of final papers by Duke undergrads being translated into FCC policy.
And did the stations here change what they were claiming?
Yes, I think it basically was the laugh test. If you thought that what you were claiming was going to be visible to everyone, then you would be less likely to write about Beverly Hills 90210 as pro-social programming.
Professor Hamilton, we have about 200 people participating in the office hours, and everyone watching can get in one last question here with Professor Hamilton. To do that, send an email to live@duke.edu, tweet your question with the tag Duke Live, or post it on the Duke University Facebook page. Talking about the FCC, I think we have to mention the possibility of them leading a proposal on expanding broadband access out, subsidizing it, federally subsidizing it to increase access. Your thoughts, good idea, bad idea? Would that affect how news media is consumed?
I think that if you look at what we're trying to do at the DeWitt Wallace Center, we're focused on two questions. How do you sustain the watchdog or accountability function of government? And how do you better meet the information needs of low-income individuals? With that second question, if you're nobody's marginal consumer or marginal voter, information is not being created for you. And if you look at some counties in North Carolina, say Bertie County, which is a very impoverished county, they have 25% of the folks who have broadband there. Their superintendent of schools is starting a program where, starting in September, they're going to use Title I education funds to give 85% of the kids in the school system, those are the people on free or reduced lunch, free internet for 5 years and free broadband access. And researchers at Duke's Child and Family Policy Center and at the DeWitt Wallace Center are going to be part of studying that. So I think it's an empirical question about what the rollout of broadband will mean. One way you could look at it is just say, this is about fairness or equity. And so in a paternalistic way, you might say, I want to subsidize people's information consumption. However, you could also say the social pie gets bigger if people are connected by broadband because of this positive spillovers on health, education, and voting. The superintendent at Bertie County used to be a superintendent in Manassas, Virginia. He said in Manassas, Virginia, a Washington bedroom community, he'd roll in, there'd be 30 emails from families complaining, and he liked that. He said in Bertie, he's not getting complaints. So he wants people to be connected as a way to hold government more accountable.
Good. Okay, so in wrapping up the office hours here, give us an action item. If somebody picks up the newspaper in the morning and says, I'm not satisfied with this, and they're willing to reach into their wallet, make that connection for us. What can somebody do with their wallet to influence the kind of journalism that we're taking in?
Well, it's great that the FCC has just started this rulemaking where they're asking the public, give us your ideas, give us your sense of how media markets are working. And their comments are open through March 8th. So for the folks who are listening now, if you have ideas about what you think media markets are doing and how they could be improved, what you may want to do is send those in directly to the FCC. The other thing is, you're right, that there is a strong nonprofit element. So the next time you hear Frank Stacio's voice, remember that Frank needs to eat too, the person at WUNC who does the state of things. And you shouldn't be a free rider. When I teach my class on media economics, I say to my students, who has contributed to National Public Radio? Everybody listens, only a small percent contribute. So it's viewers and listeners like you who actually need to step up and send in the contribution.
Professor Hamilton, thank you for coming in and doing online office hours. And we should say that you're also the author of You Are What You Choose with your colleague here, Scott DeMarchi. And so this is a whole other topic, how we make decisions, a traits profile, so a very fascinating book. And everyone who's watching that wants to follow Professor Hamilton's work on news media, you can log on to the DeWitt Wallace website at dewitt.sanford.duke.edu. You can also come back here to Duke's Ustream channel next Friday at noon when Professor Randy Mattori will be holding online office hours about African-inspired religions. To learn more about Duke, visit duke.edu.